This is Vellum Aura. The camera makes everyone a tourist in other people's reality, and eventually in one's own. Susan Sontag. Prince Thomas's The Light of Other Days is a drawing series that intersects Thomas's interests in news and journalism with his explorations into the process of grief and mourning in both private and public contexts. Referencing print media, specifically images found in newspapers, the series of charcoal drawings are drawn as half-tone patterns that are influenced by various tragic events, including murder, violence, migration, terrorism, and environmental tragedies that have occurred around the world and speak to our times. From these original press photos, Thomas has distilled, fragmented, and restructured distinct moments that express painful loss in global terms that speak directly toward the state of the world. The following was a statement from the Hooks Epstein Galleries regarding the Light of Other Days show. From this statement, we can now begin to contextualize the different pieces and piece together what sort of discourses that Thomas is engaging in. In the Light of Other Days, Thomas sets his and the viewer's attention to media, in particular the ways in which digital media has changed how we empathize with the individuals caught up in situations of loss, distress, and even tragedy. Unfortunately, if the viewer skips over the statement I just read, or doesn't have a knowledge of the discourse that Thomas is engaging with, they will be lost. To get a deeper understanding of The Light of Other Days, we can look to essayist Susan Sontag and her essay In Plato's Cave. In this essay, Sontag explores how photography has changed visual communication by providing a massive trove of images, pictures, symbols, and sheer data to process and explore. Sontag sees photography as a grammar that has altered how we process information. Sontag explores how photography has allowed viewers and photographers to feel as if they own an experience, that by taking a photograph, they are able to preserve that moment and share it with others. Sontag sees this knowledge of a moment as not as perfect as it seems, or as truthful and realistic as the audience believes it to be. Ultimately, the photograph becomes a distortion, or an imperfect representation of events. Sontag sees that photography provides a knowledge, but an often sentimental or weaponized one that only gives the viewer a semblance of knowledge, a semblance of wisdom. Based on the works that make up The Light of Other Days, Thomas is aware of this nature of the photograph and capitalizes on this semblance of knowledge through the stylization of the photograph away from appearing realistic and instead abstracts the images, making their subject matter from a distance vague and without the context of a title difficult to decipher. For example, Jackie Meets Coretta looks like two women shaking hands or exchanging gifts. It is not until the viewer is aware of the title that the drawing is of Jackie Kennedy and Coretta Scott King meeting after the assassinations of their husbands. In Funeral March, the drawing appears to look more like an album cover or basic pop art. It is not until the viewer gets closer and sees that it is the royal family at the funeral of Princess Diana of Wales do they realize the significance of the image. Both of these drawings also require the viewer to remember those images from when they were first distributed, or at least be aware of the history surrounding those images, to see them within their context. Even the title requires the viewer to know who Coretta Scott King or Jackie Kennedy are, and know that their husbands were both assassinated within a decade of each other during the civil rights movement, of which the four figures were involved. Funeral March itself requires that the viewer is familiar with the very specific image of the royal family to even make the connection between the royal family, Diana's death, and the image featured in Thomas's Funeral March. Thomas highlights how the image itself is a semblance of history. What Thomas is doing in The Light of Other Days is walking a careful line of sanctifying the photograph and throwing away the small semblance that we have left of historical knowledge. By using such a blurry and harder to digest visual style, Thomas forces the viewer to understand that while many, such as himself, can understand the images and see them instantly, those who are not impacted through the context of tragedy provided by other media see only an image until they are confronted with the title of each work. In addition to Thomas's approach to style and title, a specific approach to medium provides the greatest contradictions. Thomas's work extends into playing with medium and style, combining the style of mass-produced images and the art of drawing. By hand drawing each image, Thomas took painstaking care to preserve and maintain a high contrast between black and white. This delivers a very graphic feel to each image. but this feeling is mitigated quickly after the first gaze. A quick look reveals that it is actually charcoal, which gives almost a ashy, burned like quality to the content. This quality is strange to look at first, as it feels similar to a cave painting. This contradiction of print media and of a hand drawn image is striking and highly affective. This contradiction goes deep, not only into creating tension between the modern and the ancient, but also the mass produced and the handcrafted, the sterile and the organic, the sincere and insincere. Human emotion and the semblance of human emotion. These contradictions may seem to be pointing out how primitive photography is and how it is telling of a more innocent time, but instead, it is highlighting how, even though we may consume images of pain and suffering, that we often fail to empathize with individuals affected by the events covered in the media. In other words, Thomas is asking us to confront how mass media can dehumanize the people involved in the stories that they are covering and strip us from our most basic human emotion, empathy. In War Autocracy and Honor Killing, images of conflicts and violence in the Middle East are depicted in an even more abstracted way. This abstraction and vagueness may be the artist's way of highlighting the controversy and politicization of the Middle East and events occurring in the region. This highlighting of politics is subtle and easily missed, but is obvious when knowledgeable with the artist's prior work and focus on the history of abstraction of current events and conflicts in the Middle East. In his 2014 piece titled Letters from Congress, Thomas reproduces a letter from the United States Library of Congress which cautioned CNN to not air claims of, quote, widespread devastation, unquote. The focus on this piece is not just on the words of the letter, which indicate censorship by the US government, but also how a significant amount of it is redacted and censored, and is preventing us as a population from being able to comprehend the extent of these conflicts. Similarly, in War Autocracy and Honor Killing, Thomas abstracts the image in the same way that media abstracts events, through reducing the detail and removing the element of human suffering from their coverage, or providing a semblance of suffering that is neatly packaged for mass consumption. Another piece that calls the viewer to question their approach to media and politics is Election Night. In Election Night, Hillary Clinton is portrayed with a large circle behind her head and what appears to be a perplexed and disappointed facial expression on election night after her presidential loss to Donald Trump. At first, this inclusion may seem odd, considering that even though Donald Trump's victory was a surprise to many, it was also considered a positive by a fairly large chunk of the country. While other topics such as the death of Princess Diana, natural disasters, and school shootings are viewed as universally negative. The image, on the other hand, is much more up to the individual to interpret what they see. The first reading is a simplistic one. The drawing identifies the loss of Hillary Clinton as being a tragedy in and of itself. The second interpretation is that of Hillary Clinton as an icon. And by icon, I refer to iconography, which portrays saints, martyrs, and other religious figures painted on small tiles, normally with a halo behind the head. Yet even further beyond that reading is the image of Hillary Clinton as target. This reading requires the viewer to be aware of the vitriol surrounding Clinton and how she had been a major figure of controversy since her husband's election to the White House in the 90s. This duality of target or of icon is one which is somehow both political and apolitical at the same time. It creates tension between the narratives of Hillary Clinton, the liberal martyr, and the narrative of Hillary Clinton as the threat that needs to be eliminated. The subjects of these images are clearly suffering, but this comparison of an election loss with the loss of life appears odd at first. But within the context of the rest of the show, it serves as a question mark. Election night is asking the viewer to reassess how they approach images in the media, especially those which portray pain, suffering, disappointment, and loss. While it is not fair to say that Hillary Clinton's loss was as painful to her as losing a loved one in a terror attack or a natural disaster, this image is included as a way to draw attention to how much politics has made the suffering of people into objects for our consumption. Thomas asks us how we approach the portrayal of the experiences of others. When we see an image of someone, how do we view them? As martyrs and saints? Or as targets? When we are confronted with images in the news, are we the sort of person to glorify people for their suffering? Do we see them as deserving of their pain? Or do we see the image for what it simply is, a portrayal of human suffering? The Light of Other Days asks us whose pain is politicized, whose pain is relevant, and forces the viewer to assess their biases when looking at an image of human suffering. Prince Thomas asks us to break through the bombardment of images meant to persuade us, and instead practice empathy before engagement. When someone says that those who died in a storm should have evacuated or planned better, he confronts us with portrayals of parents and their children. When someone uses the death of children to promote arming teachers or banning guns, he confronts us with the images of children evacuating and trying to console one another. When someone states that bombing the Middle East till it is glass is the solution to the various conflicts in the region, Thomas confronts us with the images of mothers, widows, and civilians distraught and mourning. The Light of Other Days ultimately calls upon the viewer and society to turn off their impulse to instantly turn the lives of others into political talking points, but instead empathize with others. And perhaps this is one of the most important messages in our present day. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, and share. If you have any questions on how to support or contribute to this channel, please contact us at vellumora@gmail.com.